Stephen Lawrence was just 18 years old. Born on September 13th, 1974, in southeast London, he was the first child of Neville and Doreen Lawrence, both of whom were of Jamaican descent. 2 years after Stephen was born, his younger brother Stuart came along. And a few years after that, when Stephen was 8, they welcomed their youngest, Georgina. Stephen was the kind of person who made an impression. He was determined, headstrong, stubborn, in a way that wasn't always a bad thing. He just knew what he wanted in life. And once he set his mind on something, he'd chase it with everything he had. He was creative, a gifted artist with a talent for drawing that stood out even from a young age. But more than anything, he was athletic. Stephen was a runner, a natural one. He took part in local races, marathons, and all kinds of athletic competitions, and he excelled in them. Winning wasn't everything to him, but he just happened to win a lot. At college, he studied technology, physics, English language, and English literature. He had big dreams, and one day, he hoped to turn those dreams into a future. He wanted to become an architect. He was focused, driven, full of potential, and above all, he was just a good kid, the kind of son any parent would be proud of. It was a Thursday, April 22nd, 1993. Stephen Lawrence, 18 years old, had spent the day like any other. He'd gone to college, hung out with his friend Dwayne Brooks afterward, and the two of them decided to head into Lewisham just to browse the shops. Nothing serious, just two friends wasting time like teenagers do. After about an hour, they made their way to Stephen's uncle's house. They played some video games for a while, not realizing how quickly the night was slipping by. Before long, it was getting close to 10 o'clock, and Stephen knew he needed to be home by 10:30. That was his mom's rule, and he didn't want to break it. So they left in a rush, heading straight to the bus stop. But the usual bus, the one that would have taken them straight home, wasn't due to arrive until 10:30, and that meant Stephen would already be late. He didn't like that. So the boys started coming up with another plan. Maybe they could take a few shorter bus routes instead, get home faster by switching lines along the way. The first couple buses went smoothly. By the time they arrived in Eltham, the final stop before heading home, it was 10:25. Stephen had 5 minutes left. He knew he wouldn't make it home on time, but he was trying, still trying. They waited, but the last bus they needed was running late. It still hadn't shown up by 10:35. Stephen was now officially late, and it was eating at him. He started getting anxious, worried his mom would be upset, or worse, that she'd be scared. So he told Dwayne he was just going to walk a little ahead to a junction down the road, just to check if he could see the bus coming from that direction. He was only gone for a few seconds. Stephen reached the end of the road, looked both ways, nothing. And then, just as he turned back to walk toward Dwayne, he heard it, shouting. Stephen looked across the street and saw them. 5 or 6 white boys running full speed toward him. They were yelling racist slurs, screaming hate. And then they were on him. Dwayne, still at the bus stop, could only stand there, frozen in shock, as he watched the scene unfold. One of the attackers raised a knife high over his head and brought it down hard into Stephen's shoulder. And then again, another blow, this time into the opposite side, near his collarbone. Both wounds were deep, brutal. The knife had gone 13 centimeters, over 5 inches, into Stephen's body. One stab had punctured his lung. The other had cut open 2 major arteries. Stephen would have been bleeding out in seconds. He would have lost feeling in his right arm. And by then, he would have been struggling to breathe. And this happened just steps away from his friend, on a quiet road, on a normal night, for no reason except for the color of his skin. At that point, Dwayne Brooks realized something terrifying. He might be next. This wasn't just a random fight. It was a racist attack, vicious and targeted. They'd run up to Stephen yelling slurs and stabbed him twice, without hesitation. So Dwayne did the only thing he could do. He ran, and he shouted for Stephen to run too. Incredibly, even with a punctured lung, severed arteries, and struggling for breath, Stephen ran. He managed to run 20 meters before his body finally gave out. He collapsed on the pavement, bleeding out fast. Dwayne sprinted to the nearest phone box and called for an ambulance. He told them his friend was dying. He explained that Stephen had been stabbed and was bleeding badly. But instead of sending paramedics, they sent a police car. When officers arrived, Dwayne was furious. His best friend was bleeding to death in the street. And instead of medical help, they'd sent someone with a badge and no equipment. So the officers called for an ambulance themselves, but even then, they didn't rush to Stephen's side. They didn't check his breathing. They didn't do CPR. They didn't even try. Instead, they turned to Dwayne and started questioning him. Stephen's best friend, the only witness to the attack, the one who had been there the whole time, telling them exactly what happened. They treated him like a suspect. Police asked if maybe he and Stephen had been fighting, if maybe Dwayne had done this, or maybe it was some kind of gang activity. Anything but the truth that Dwayne was trying to give them. And while this was happening, Stephen lay there, unattended, unchecked, uncared for. Even if police thought Stephen was already dead, they had a duty to make sure. They could have done something, checked his pulse, opened his airway, applied pressure to the wound. But they didn't. Dwayne was begging them, literally begging, to help his friend, to at least look at him, to check his chest. But the officers just didn't. And because they didn't look, didn't listen, didn't believe Dwayne, they assumed Stephen had a head injury. They thought the blood was from a blow to the skull, not stab wounds to the chest. Even when Dwayne told them, clear as day, they stabbed him in the chest. They ignored it. They ignored him, and they ignored Stephen. In the years that followed, the actions, or rather, the inaction of the officers who arrived at the scene that night came under intense scrutiny. And rightfully so, because even if they believed Stephen was already gone, they still should have known what to do. But when those very officers were later investigated, something unthinkable came to light. They weren't trained in basic first aid. Not even the ABC rule, the very first step in any emergency response. A stands for airways, B for breathing, C for circulation. That's the foundation of first aid. It's what you check first when someone's collapsed, whether their airway is clear, if they're breathing, if their heart is beating. It's standard in any basic UK first aid course. But during the investigation, when these officers were asked what ABC even meant, none of them could answer. Not one. Not even a guess. Not even one of the letters. The people who had been sent to a scene where a young boy lay dying didn't know how to help him. And so they didn't. They stood there. They questioned the wrong person. They misdiagnosed the injuries. And they did nothing. Not because they were malicious, but because they were unprepared. And maybe, just maybe, because they didn't care enough to be prepared. And while they fumbled around, trying to decide what story made the most sense to them, Stephen Lawrence was bleeding to death on the ground, alone, as Dwayne and the officers waited for the ambulance. Stephen lay on the cold pavement, bleeding, alone, and still, no one knelt beside him. No one checked his pulse. No one held his hand. The police stood nearby, but they did nothing. But then, two strangers happened to walk by. Their names were Connor and Louise Taff. They weren't doctors. They weren't first responders. They didn't even know Stephen. But they saw him. They saw a boy, just a boy, bleeding on the ground while the people in uniform stood back and watched. So they stepped in. They didn't have medical training. They didn't know how to stop the bleeding. But they knelt beside him anyway. They did the one thing that no one else at the scene had thought to do. They showed him kindness. Louise knelt down and held Stephen's hand. She spoke to him softly, told him he was loved, that he wasn't alone, that people cared. And Connor, kneeling close by, prayed. He prayed for Stephen, for his family, for peace. They couldn't save him, but in those final moments, they made sure he wasn't alone. They gave him what no one else at the scene had: humanity, presence, dignity. Finally, an ambulance arrived. Stephen was rushed to the hospital, but it was already too late. Though doctors did everything they could, it's believed that Stephen had already died within minutes of collapsing to the ground. The injuries had been too severe. The blood loss is too fast. His body just couldn't keep going. Within the hour, Stephen's family was informed. They made their way to the hospital, hearts shattered, barely able to process what they were being told. When Doreen Lawrence, Stephen's mother, saw her son, what struck her most was how peaceful he looked. Almost like he was smiling. Almost like he was just asleep. She had expected to see fear in his face, or pain, or anger, because of the way he was taken, because of how violently he'd been attacked. But there was none of that. She later said it was as if Stephen didn't know what was happening. Like maybe he hadn't expected to die. Maybe the pain hadn't registered yet. Maybe in his final moments, he was still just a boy trying to get home to his mom. That image stayed with her. That peace. From there, the murder investigation officially began. One officer was appointed as the lead investigator. But almost immediately, it was clear that he couldn't handle it. He was already juggling multiple cases, overwhelmed, stretched thin, and instead of stepping back and saying, "I can't do this," he took the case anyway. Whether it was pride, pressure, or simply poor decision-making, he accepted the responsibility. But within a few days, he had to pass it on. And that meant the entire investigation had to be started again. Every lead, every statement, every detail. The new officer had to be caught up from scratch. And that took time. Precious time. By the time the case was properly underway again, 5 or 6 days had passed. 5 or 6 days where evidence could have been collected. Witnesses questioned. Suspects tracked. Lives changed. Instead, that window was lost. And in a murder case, 5 days is everything. There were 3 witnesses to Stephen's murder. His friend, Dwayne Brooks, of course, and 2 other people who had been standing nearby at the bus stop when the attack happened. All 3 gave witness statements. And right away, Dwayne was ruled out as a suspect. His account was consistent. It matched the timeline. It matched the panic. It matched the trauma. But none of the witnesses were able to identify the attackers. It had all happened so fast, just seconds of chaos, yelling, violence, and then it was over. The attackers had come out of nowhere and then disappeared just as quickly into the night. But despite the lack of visual ID, people started talking. In the days after the murder, several members of the public came forward with possible names, suspects, rumors, gangs. Some people called the police directly. Others left anonymous tips and notes on police cars, hidden in phone boxes, phoning the station to tell officers where to look. It became clear that the people being named weren't just schoolboys. They were dangerous. People were afraid. Afraid to speak. Afraid of retaliation. Afraid of being next. But the names kept coming. And within days, 5 suspects began to stand out. A gang of young boys from Eltham. The group was led by 17-year-old Neil Accord, whose younger brother, 16-year-old Jamie Accord, was also in the gang. Then there was Gary Dobson, 17, believed to be the brains of the group. Not a leader, but the one who often thought through what others acted on. Cold, quiet, calculated. Luke Knight, also 16, violent, reckless, easily provoked. And finally, David Norris, another 16-year-old. But unlike the others, David came from power. He was the son of a notorious gangster and drug dealer in the area. These weren't just random kids. They had names that people feared. And now, those names were finally being spoken out loud. This gang of 5 boys from Eltham, they weren't just rumors. They were well known, and not in a good way. They had a fascination with knives. They were known to carry them, and they weren't afraid to use them. These weren't boys who just hung around street corners. They were violent, and they had a history of racial attacks. Long before Stephen. Just 4 weeks before Stephen Lawrence was murdered, Gary Dobson and Neil Accord attacked a young black teenager named Kevin London. They tried to stab him. It was vicious, and it was unprovoked. Around the same time, Neil, Jamie, David, and Gary were all accused in another stabbing, this time involving 2 victims, Gertie and Stacy. And a year earlier, Jimmy Accord, Neil's younger brother, had stabbed another black teenager named Aaron Witham. So this wasn't just one incident. This was a pattern, a gang of young men carrying knives, targeting black boys in their community, again and again. And now, Stephen Lawrence has been killed in the exact same way. And the names were the same. Neil, Jamie, David, Gary, Luke. So many members of the public had pointed to them. So many warnings. So many prior incidents. The dots were all there. But still, none of them were arrested. Not right away. Not even with that history. Not even with eyewitnesses. Not even with blood on the pavement. And the question hangs in the air, why not? At this point in the investigation, there may not have been hard evidence yet, but there was absolutely reasonable suspicion. 5 names, a pattern of violence, a known gang, multiple public tips. And still, the boys weren't arrested. They weren't even questioned. They weren't placed under surveillance. Nothing. Instead, police made one move. They placed a photographer outside an abandoned house the gang was known to frequent, a place they used as their sort of hideout, their base. But not a police officer, not someone who could intervene, just a man with a camera. And that decision may have cost the case critical evidence, because one day, the photographer saw something. He saw Jimmy Accord, the younger of the Accord brothers, carrying a large bin bag out of the building. It was full of something, no one knows what, but the assumption was that it could have been evidence. Jimmy placed the bag into his car and drove away. And the photographer, because it was the 1990s and he didn't have a phone, had no way to call it in. He couldn't follow. He couldn't stop him. All he could do was take a picture. By the time he told police what he'd seen, it was already too late. Whatever had been in that bag was gone. Burned, dumped, disposed of, lost forever. Had there been a surveillance officer instead of a photographer, they would have followed Jimmy. They could have recovered that evidence. But instead, it slipped through their fingers. And this wasn't the only mistake. Years later, when an internal review was done into the failures of this case, another missed opportunity came to light. A woman who may have witnessed Stephen's murder tried to contact police 3 separate times in the days following the attack. 3 times she called. 3 times she left voicemails, asking, begging for someone to call her back. No one ever did. And while it's understandable that the police were overwhelmed, this was one of the most critical parts of the investigation. Taking calls, listening to voicemails, following leads. There's no excuse for letting a witness like that slip away. There's no excuse for not calling her back. It was yet another moment, another chance to do the right thing that was simply wasted. And unfortunately, in the case of Stephen Lawrence, that pattern would continue. And it would have been one thing if the police had just missed one call, maybe one voicemail. Mistakes happen. People get overwhelmed. You can understand that. But to miss 3 separate calls and to ignore 3 voicemails from the same woman who may have witnessed Stephen's murder, that's not just a mistake. That's negligence. And it raises a terrifying question. How much other information was ignored? How many other voices were left unheard? And unfortunately, that wasn't the only system that failed. Early in the investigation, police decided to use a computer system called HOMES, short for Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. It was designed specifically for cases like this. It could hold a massive amount of information, accessible to multiple officers at once. It organized case files so that the most important leads appeared first, right on the home screen. It was supposed to make solving major crimes faster and more efficient. But in the case of Stephen Lawrence, it did the opposite. Less than half of the officers assigned to the case even knew how to use it. So what happened? The officers who did understand the system tried their best. They uploaded tips, witness statements, phone numbers, everything they could. But the other half, they either couldn't access that information, or worse, they tried to use the system and ended up inputting data incorrectly. Names went in the wrong places. Important leads were buried deep in the wrong folders. Vital information was lost. And so what should have been an organized, streamlined system became a black hole. Information disappeared. Witnesses were missed. Time was wasted. And a case that already felt heavy with injustice became even harder to solve. As the investigation crawled forward, it became heartbreakingly clear that something deeper was influencing the way Stephen's case was being treated. The police assumed the worst about him. They didn't see an 18-year-old college student. They didn't see an aspiring architect. They didn't see a son, a brother, a friend. They saw a black boy, and they made a judgment. They assumed Stephen must have been in a gang. They assumed he must have known his attackers. They assumed it was drug-related, or crime-related, or that somehow he had brought this on himself. This, despite multiple witnesses telling them the truth, telling them that it was a group of white boys, that it was unprovoked, that they were yelling racist slurs, that they stabbed him and ran. The police had that information, but they still chose to build a narrative around Stephen being a criminal. And to many, including Stephen's own family, the reason for that was devastatingly clear, because he was black. That's why they didn't believe Dwayne. That's why they didn't rush to save Stephen. That's why they didn't return calls or follow leads or put real urgency behind the case. Because on some level, they believed he deserved it. That it was just gang violence, and Stephen was just another name in a long list they didn't care to investigate. That's what makes this case so hard to tell. It's not just about a brutal, racist murder. It's about how the system responded, or more accurately, how it didn't. Instead of hunting for Stephen's killers, the police spent their time interrogating the people who were grieving him. They questioned Stephen's parents. They questioned his friends. They went through his entire family's criminal records, even though none of that had anything to do with Stephen's murder. It was like they were trying to prove a story they'd already decided was true. They didn't want the real story. The one witnesses had already told them that a black teenager was murdered in a racially motivated attack by a known local gang. They wanted to find anything else. Anything that made Stephen the problem. Anything that let them avoid looking at the 5 boys everyone was talking about. Because the truth is, police had 22 separate tip-offs about this one specific gang. The same gang. The same 5 boys. With known histories of racially motivated violence. Knife crime. Stabbings. Hate. But the police didn't act. Not for a day. Not for a week. It took 10 days. 10 days after Stephen Lawrence was murdered in the street, before anyone was arrested. And even then, it only happened because the world was watching. Nelson Mandela was visiting the UK at the time. He heard about Stephen's murder. He requested a meeting with Doreen and Neville Lawrence. And after sitting with them, hearing their story, hearing their pain, Mandela held a press conference. He stood in front of the British press and said, "From what I hear from the Lawrences, black lives are cheap in this country." That one sentence, spoken by one of the most powerful and respected voices in the world, shamed the police into finally doing what they should have done from the start. They arrested Neil and Jamie Accord, Gary Dobson, David Norris, who actually turned himself in 3 days later, and finally, Luke Knight, almost a month after the others. But even then it felt performative, because the interrogations? Useless. Every single boy answered with the same 2 words, no comment, again and again, to every question, even when one of them was only questioned for 7 minutes, and only asked 7 questions total. And the searches of their homes? Just as careless. Police had received a tip that the boys were hiding weapons beneath their floorboards. But that tip was never passed on to the officers conducting the search. So, they didn't look. And by this point, after weeks of delay, anything forensic was long gone. Clothing had been washed, weapons burned or disposed of, memories faded, time lost, and with it, so much evidence. Despite everything that had gone wrong, police did manage to seize some clothing from the suspects, items that matched witness descriptions of what the attackers were wearing that night. They also conducted a police lineup, and when witnesses were asked to identify the attackers, several of them picked out Neil Accord, including Dwayne Brooks, Stephen's best friend, the one who had been right there, the one who saw it happen. So with that, police believed they finally had enough to move forward. Neil Accord was formally charged with murder. Then, more than a month later, a second boy, Luke Knight, was charged as well. But it didn't last. Just over a month after that, the prosecution dropped the charges. They claimed the evidence wasn't strong enough, that the case wouldn't hold in court. And just like that, it was gone. 2 arrests, 2 charges, no trial. By August of that same year, after public pressure mounted, the police were forced to conduct an internal review of how they had handled Stephen's case. But when the report came back in April of the following year, the officer who conducted the review, who had reviewed his own team, said that everything had been done properly. He praised the investigation, said procedures had been followed, said there was nothing to see here. Of course he did, because if he told the truth, he'd be implicating himself. Why would he risk that? So the case went quiet. The public grew tired. Stephen's family stayed grieving. But years later, more than a decade later, long after the case had finally been solved, a new review was done. An independent review, one that didn't come from within the same failing system. And what it found was devastating, but not surprising. The first investigation? Corrupt. The first review? A lie. The officer who had defended his own team? Wrong. And he knew it. The review uncovered just how much had gone wrong. How many leads had been missed. How many lies had been told? How many chances at justice had been ignored? And finally, years and years too late, the police were forced to issue a public apology. But by then, it wasn't just about Stephen anymore. It was about every family that had ever been told to wait, every case that had been dismissed, every truth that had been buried. For an entire year after Stephen Lawrence was murdered, the case went cold. Despite the tireless campaigning from his family, despite growing public outrage, despite everything they already knew about the suspects, police did almost nothing. But eventually, under pressure, they tried to make it look like they were stepping up. They planted a hidden camera and recording device in the flat Gary Dobson was renting. The idea was that maybe he'd invite the gang over and maybe, just maybe, they'd talk about the murder. But by then, it had been a full year. And unsurprisingly, when police listened to the tapes, they didn't hear anything about Stephen. No confessions, no slip-ups, nothing useful for prosecution. Why would there be? If these boys were guilty, they wouldn't still be talking about it a year later. Not during casual hangouts. Not in conversations they didn't know were being recorded. That's something police should have tried within weeks of the murder, not 12 months after. But they did hear something else. Something sickening. They heard vile, racist language. Over and over again. Pure hate. And while it wasn't evidence of the murder itself, it was powerful enough to show motive. It was a glimpse into who these boys really were. But still, not enough to charge them. So once again, the police said the same thing. We don't have enough evidence. And finally, after hearing that line one too many times, Stephen's family had enough. They did something almost unheard of. They withdrew the case from the Crown Prosecution Service, the official body that handles all prosecutions in the UK, and decided to go private. They were going to prosecute Stephen's killers themselves. It was bold, it was unprecedented, and it was very, very risky. Because if this private prosecution failed, if the gang was acquitted due to lack of evidence, then under the double jeopardy law, they could never be tried again for Stephen's murder. This was their one shot. They had to get it right. Because if they didn't, Stephen's killers would walk free. Forever. In April 1994, a full year after Stephen's murder, Jimmy Acourt, Gary Dobson, and David Norris finally stood trial. This was the private prosecution, the one that Stephen's family had fought so hard to bring to court. It was bold, risky, their only shot, their strongest piece of evidence. Dwayne Brooks. He had identified two of the suspects in police lineups. He'd seen the attack with his own eyes. He was the key witness. But in court, Dwayne had to face cross-examination, not just to retell what he saw, but to prove that he was a reliable witness. And under pressure, in a courtroom filled with people who didn't believe him, he struggled. He was ruled unreliable. His identification of the suspects was thrown out. And just like that, the entire case collapsed. After only a week of trial, Dobson, Knight, and Jamie Acourt were acquitted. Once again, Stephen's killers walked free. Another police inquiry was launched. And for 3 years, the case seemed to drift quietly into the background. No headlines, no outrage, just waiting. But the outcome of that inquiry finally put into words what everyone already knew. Stephen Lawrence had been the victim of an unlawful killing in a completely unprovoked racist attack by 5 white youths. It was official now, but still, nothing had changed. Until February 1997. That's when the British newspaper The Daily Mail did something bold, something unforgettable. Stephen's name hadn't been in the headlines for nearly 4 years. But suddenly, he was front-page news again. The headline? Murderers in huge capital letters. Beneath the word were the photos, names, and ages of all 5 suspects. The Acourt brothers, Dobson, Knight, Norris. And here's the thing, they weren't convicted. They weren't legally guilty. So calling them murderers was a huge legal risk. But the Daily Mail stood firm. At the bottom of the page, they wrote, "The Mail accuses these men of killing Stephen Lawrence. If we are wrong, let them sue us." It was one of the boldest moves in British media history, and it lit a fire. Stephen's story was back. But this time, the public was angrier than ever. Protests returned. Campaigns reignited. And now, people weren't just hoping for justice. They were demanding it. But even after all the headlines, even after the Daily Mail's front-page accusation, even after public pressure surged once again, police still weren't doing anything. Or at least, that's how it felt. They couldn't say exactly what they were working on. They couldn't name a suspect, or a timeline, or any clear next steps. All they said was, "We're working on it." And then, in 2004, came the blow no one wanted to hear. The Crown Prosecution Service announced that there was still insufficient evidence to prosecute anyone for the murder of Stephen Lawrence. For Stephen's family, it was the worst possible news. After more than a decade of fighting, of campaigning, of hoping, they were told that no one would pay for what had been done. It felt like the end. But then, 1 year later, in 2005, everything changed. The law changed. Double jeopardy, which had previously prevented anyone from being tried twice for the same crime, was now allowed to be repealed in cases of serious crimes, like murder and rape, if new evidence emerged. That tiny clause opened a door, and Stephen's case walked through it. In June 2006, police launched a re-examination of the case. This time, they weren't looking for new witnesses. They weren't re-interviewing suspects. They were turning to forensics. Because the first time they tested the boy's clothing, it was 1993. Now, it was 2006, and forensic science had come a long way. And then they found something on the collar of Gary Dobson's jacket. They found a microscopic droplet of blood. Stephen's blood. It was so small, less than half a millimeter wide. But it was enough. Investigators believe that during the attack, possibly after the second stabbing, when a knife was pulled from Stephen's body, that droplet sprayed and landed on Dobson's collar. And there it stayed, undetected for 13 years, waiting until science caught up, until someone finally took another look. And when they did, that microscopic stain matched. It was Stephen's blood, and now, everything was about to change. The scientific evidence was undeniable. The microscopic blood stain on Gary Dobson's jacket, there was a 1 in a billion chance it belonged to anyone else. Fibers from Stephen's polo shirt were also found. 99.9% match, embedded in Dobson's clothing. And on an item belonging to David Norris, police found tiny hairs that matched Stephen's DNA. After all these years, the forensic truth finally spoke. So in May 2011, nearly 18 years after Stephen Lawrence was murdered, Gary Dobson and David Norris, now in their 30s, were arrested again, and this time, charged with his murder. Their trial began in November 2011. It lasted 2 months. The evidence was clear. The lies had run out. And on January 3rd, 2012, both men were found guilty of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. After almost 2 decades, justice was finally delivered. Both Dobson and Norris received life sentences. But because they had been 16 and 17 years old when they committed the murder, they were sentenced as juveniles under UK law. Gary Dobson was given a minimum of 15 years. David Norris, 14 years. Had they been sentenced as adults, the minimum terms would have likely been 25 to 30 years. Still, for Stephen's family, it was more than just a verdict. It was a validation, a recognition that their son was murdered not by ghosts or rumors, but by real people, now held accountable in the eyes of the law. And then, in April 2018, something else changed. British Prime Minister Theresa May made an announcement. Starting the following year, the United Kingdom would recognize April 22nd, the day Stephen was killed, as Stephen Lawrence Day. A day to remember, a day to reflect, a day to educate young people across the country about racism, injustice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Because Stephen's life, his future, was stolen, but his name would live on, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance, resilience, and change.